With MBTI being so biased towards intuitives, it can be difficult to figure out whether you are intuitive or sensor. So you really want to consider how um, this intuitive bias is impacting your test results and your opinions about each personality types. So one thing you might want to check out is more sort of content that shows the more positive aspects of sensing, because a lot of the stuff you will look at online is very much intuitives, the various personality type content, and that can be quite distracting when you're trying to figure out which one actually am I. And so trying to find more content that actually shows the positives of senses. So how, for example, the routines and stuff can be very fascinating of how introverted sensing works, for example. And there's a lot of positives about senses that aren't usually very reflected online because everyone wants to be the rarest personality type a lot of the time. So that can be a real challenge in trying to figure out what you actually are. Um, in terms of actually just looking at which one you are, once you've dealt with that, um, obviously intuitives are a lot more likely to be in their heads a lot in like the abstract, whereas the sensing ones are more likely to be in the real world. This can be difficult to distinguish sometimes between the introversion and extroversion because they're also in the head versus in the real world. But I think the important distinction to make is um, when you're talking about intuitives and sensing, it's very much in the heads versus the real world, whereas introverts are very much them versus other people. So, an example of a distinguishment between this is you could take an extroverted intuition dominant person, maybe an ENTP, ENFP, um, and this person is not in the real world, they're at home on a computer and they're um, interacting with the world online potentially. So maybe they're on a online forum or something, and they're in this really heated debate with random online strangers, for example. That would be an example of how they are using their extroversion in their dominant function, but not necessarily interacting as much with the real world. Whereas you might have introverted sensor, so let's say an ISTJ, who would maybe go out every morning for a walk, and they're doing that alone, which is their introversion, but they're also doing it in the real world, which is their sensing. So that is a quite useful distinction to realize because if you kind of mix the two together a lot of the time, it can be very confusing if you don't sort of understand the distinction between the two. Uh, Another thing is how intuitives often do feel misunderstood by the world in general because senses are more common. That can be a thing that comes up a lot with intuitives. How it's just like people don't understand me. That kind of thing is a lot more common with intuitives than sensors. Whereas because sensors being more common, they just get that naturally. Whereas with intuitives, I think the reason a lot of intuitives come to MBTI and stick with it is because it's the first time that they've felt understood a lot of the time. Um, so because it provides you such an in-depth analysis into yourself, the whole thing's abstract as well. It does lead to a lot more of an intuitive community than sensor community compared to the rest of the world. So I mean, there is a great. So while sensors are more common in the general population, there is like a slight bias in favor of intuitives, definitely compared to the rest of the world when you're looking at MBTI communities, which is why it can very much feel like why is everyone intuitive? Um, I won't go too much into depth about that in this video, but um, definitely if MBTI is something you're interested in, then it could be a sign that you are potentially more likely to be intuitive because it reflects the general sort of interest of the abstract. Like it's not a real tangible thing. Um, so yeah, it could be a sign that you're potentially more likely to be intuitive, although it doesn't guarantee it if you are interested. And sensors can also equally be interested in it. It's just more looking at, I guess, probabilities. This is quite a INTJ way of approaching this, trying to figure out the probabilities of you being a certain type, I suppose. Um, okay, hopefully you're that one step closer to figuring out whether you're an intuitive or a sensor type. And yeah, thanks for watching, and goodbye.